Welcome to Sewing with Nancy's favorite TV techniques. 20 years ago, when I first stood in front of a TV camera, I gave new meaning to the word nervous. But once I started imagining that I was teaching to a room full of people, the TV studio became a comfortable classroom. From the beginning, we've offered 26 new shows every year. Most are organized into three-part series. My staff and I gather new ideas and notions, keep a running file on topics, and develop scripts and samples when we feel we have a great series. Some of the series take months to organize, others just a few weeks, just like your sewing projects at home. I put together 8 of my favorite techniques to share with you in celebration of the 20th anniversary of Sewing with Nancy, and to give you a cross-section view of the topics we've covered. If you've never watched the show, welcome to my classroom. If you are a faithful viewer, you'll find a refresher course on some of my favorite ideas. So, take the phone off the hook, pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea, and get comfortable. I have an hour of sewing fun just for you. It's time for class to begin.
Sewing with Nancy, celebrating 20 years of Sewing with Nancy Zieman, is brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF's creative line of sewing machines and hobby lock sergers are simply the best. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. Madeira, superior quality threads from Germany, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Prim Dritz, the source for sewing and quilting notions, including products by Dritz, Collins, and Omnigrid. Amazing Designs by Great Notions, your one source for home embroidery and design software. Over 200 disc pack collections currently available, including designs by Nancy Zieman. Koala Cabinets from Australia, quality crafted, fully assembled sewing furniture, designed for maximum storage in minimum space. Rowenta, professional performance and beautiful results for all types of ironing, the choice of professionals. And Nancy's Notions Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
I'd like to start this video sampler with something old and something new. No, I'm not talking about weddings, I'm talking about quilting. Gretchen Udock, designer and author of the book Quick Quilts Using Quick Bias, joined me for a 3-part series based on her book to share her ideas and techniques for working with quick bias. This clip is a favorite because it combines something old, the traditional piecing technique, and something new, contemporary fusible bias tips. What I like about this wall hanging and quilt pattern is that it combines, as I said earlier, the traditional and contemporary techniques. The traditional being the piecing, the patchwork to create the basket, and the contemporary area of adding the handle, not with piecing, but just by pressing on fusible bias tape. Gretchen, there are 2 types of fusible tape that we can use.
Yes, this is a pre-made fusible tape. And this one happens to have all the colors in that I used in my quilt. And you would just peel off the paper backing, and the fusible element is exposed.
Sometimes the most difficult part is just to peel it off. Let's get it off. There we go.
Okay. And then you will fuse this into place and then stitch it down later.
The other option would be to make your own tape. Perhaps you didn't have fusible tape that matched the patchwork that you were using. You would cut 1/2-inch strips that are on the bias, thread them through a bias tape maker. Now this tape maker happens to have a fusible guide for 1/4 of an inch wide tape. As it comes out of the tape maker, we can catch it with the tip of the iron, and as we lead it forward there, you can press, just feeding a little bit at a time, and then as it comes out, it presses into place, and again you can just peel off the backing, and this fusible is not permanent, it works as pins.
Right, and when you're doing curves, it makes it go on very smoothly.
We're going to show you the step-by-step process of working with this quilt block, combining the traditional and the contemporary. And Gretchen, you have cut some interesting fabric combinations.
First, I have a 4 1/4 inch square of black, and I've made my template that is given in the pattern, and this is placed matching the corners, and then I've traced around this design. And this gives me the area that I can add my basket handle. Now I have a 5-inch piece of the quick bias cut to the color coordinating my basket, and then I just place it over that line and press it in place. And you can see how beautifully it goes along those curves. And it is a little bit longer, and that's what we want, because we're going to be sewing a seam. And here's one finished. and we will be stitching that down. I do have a stabilizer underneath because there's going to be no other layers under this, so we have to add the stabilizer so we don't get puckers.
Here's a close-up of the stitching of the tape onto the fabric, just stitching along the very edge. You'd stitch both along the left edge and the left edge, and I'm using monofilament thread so that the thread coordinates or blends in right with the fabric. Now you need to cut another square the same size as the black square.
And they're just placed right sides together and then stitch down the diagonal. And you want to check that you have it stitched across the base of your handle, and then you trim away 1/4 inch from the opposite side of the handle. And then this is pressed open and you get this. And what you want to do on these is press this seam flat versus the traditional method of turning them to one side. The added bulk from the handle is necessary there.
In the basket pattern we will need 2 other smaller half triangles, and to create that we're going to use Gretchen's same technique, this time cutting
2.5 inch squares.
So of the black and the coordinating color of the basket, and after you have matched the right sides together, stitch down mark down the center and stitch on either side.
And then you cut them apart, so you will be getting 2. Then you again press these open and you trim it down to 1 3/4 inches.
So out of one square, or excuse me, a pair of squares, you're going to get 2 smaller little pieces together.
And that forms the basket base.
Now we have all the elements on our right side of our table just to show you how these elements go together. So we have the center square that has the handle stitched on. We have the 2 smaller squares that are 1 3/4, and we have 1 3/4 strips.
Right, and 1 3/4 inch squares.
The next step is to do some more piecing. You can chain piece these together as well, sewing the longer strips in the square, the solid square, the piece triangles, and then of course the other portion. And when all the piecing is complete, I'll show you what we have, the finished basket. Really a unique way of making this quilt block. Now as we place this quilt block on our finished wall hanging, you can see the positioning of it. You have 5 different baskets.
And then we've taken the same size block finished to make our squares to put in between.
Take special note along the borders, how Gretchen has used the variegated quick bias to add accents, plus adding some extra square detail.
Right, and to get the color balance, I've chosen the center block to form the corners, and then I've taken the opposite color. Here I have the purple, and then the opposite color is in the corner. And then that helps balance the quilt colors.
So it's very interesting. So if you can find variegated bias that goes with your fabric, this is a wonderful solution. Or perhaps you'd like to make your own bias to coordinate with the fabric you have chosen to make your quilt. Regardless, this is a wonderful technique to use. And as we mentioned, it combines really new and old techniques to make a quick quilt. I'm sure you're aware that quilting is one of the most popular areas of Sewing with Nancy, but did you know that quilting is also a great technique for layering vests? In the series Viva la Veste, quilting was just one of the 6 different sewing options I showed to create stylish vests from one pattern. In the following clip, you'll be amazed at how easy it is to transform high loft fleece and cotton batik into a reversible vest with channel quilting inspired by the fabric choice. Our next Viva la Veste has twice the options as the standard fare. The outside can be the inside, and the inside changes to the outside, a vest with double duty. The fabric combinations are unique, high loft fleece and batik. Some may say, oh, it's just reversible. I say it's reversible, it's quilted, it has a fresh new style, and it's our next Viva la Veste style on Sewing with Nancy. Here's again the vest that I was speaking about, making it totally reversible. Interesting fabric combinations. The fabric that's used for the fleece on the outside is also used as the binding. But the channel stitching has been determined by the style of the fabric that we chose for this vest. Because it has a stripe option, we were able to stitch along the stripes. Now these stripes are not perfectly straight, which I think is kind of nice because you don't have to worry about having it just exact. But we do like to have the stripes match at the shoulder seams so that as we're coming around this area, you get a nice chevron look at the shoulder as well as at the collar, where the collar meets the front and the back. This takes just a little bit of pre-planning. Really, the planning takes place before you cut out your fabric pieces. I'm using the same fabrics or pattern styles as I used earlier. That means I've trimmed the seam allowance from the outer edge, the armholes, the same detail that I gave you for the single layer vest. So here are the pattern pieces. For this pattern, it's about a size medium. I've used 1 1/8 of the lining fabric or the batik fabric, and then about 7/8 of a yard of the high loft fleece, like polar fleece or Nordic fleece. You can get by with less because the fabric is much wider. But the key here is marking the stripes. I've stacked the fabric so that I've matched the stripes. Now, if you've worked with stripes or plaids in the past, you know that you have to stack them one on top of the other as you're cutting that out so that both front, left and right side match. So that's simply what I've done, and I would place pins periodically to make sure that my stripes are matching all the way down the yardage of the fabric. Place the pattern back, the vest back, onto your fabric, pin it into place, and then do some marking. And the marking I've done is on the shoulder seam area as well as the neckline. First, the shoulder seam. Fold under the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance of the pattern piece and mark the starting point of the stripes on your tissue paper. And I've kind of marked the right side of the stripe. You could also do the same at the neckline. Since the neckline's curved, a little harder to fold under, I'm just going to extend it a little bit longer so that you can see where that stripe goes. The purpose of this is to align the pieces that will match. On the front piece, I've also folded under the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm going to meet these folded edges together. And the way they will be sewn, so that I'll mark the starting point of those stripes right on the second tissue paper. On the back piece, I'll take the center back, which this happens to be, of the collar, fold under the seam allowance, and again mark the stripes. Now, if you're wondering, what are you going to do with this? Well, we're going to now lay out the pattern pieces of the front and the collar. Now, I realize that this front piece will not fit on this width, but just assume it would. I'll lay it out later, further down the yardage. But so that you can see a little bit more clearly how this is accomplished, I'd unfold that seam allowance and then just double check that the stripe mark and the stripe itself are aligning one on top of each other. Make sure it's on grain, but I would place a pin or my pencil point at a stripe mark, fold it back, and make certain that I'm at a stripe. That way, these two the shoulder seams will line up and match. You do the same to the collar piece. So it's just a matching step. It's really not too much of a sewing step. Cut out your pattern pieces, collars, front and back of both the fleece fabric as well as the cotton fabric as we've used here. Sew the two pattern pieces together, or the vest styles together. And then I've done some trimming of the seam allowances. Then you're going to be stacking with right sides meeting of the two vests. Going to enclose all those seams and stack them one on top of the other. Match in the ditch. Stack the seams, stitching or pinning the two fabrics together in the ditch so that they align. Also align the outer edges as well as the shoulder seams and the underarm seams, and then I'll do some sewing. I now have the two vests pinned together along the collar seam, shoulder, and underarm seam, pinning in the ditch, placing a pin in the seam line and matching it to the seam line on the opposite side so that the vests will be aligned. Also pin the outer edges or the armhole edges. It would take time now to do some zigzagging, to zigzag these outer edges together so that it's easier to attach the binding, just the way we did on the single layer vest that I showed you earlier in today's program. After the zigzag stitching, try some pinning, lots of pins. Use curved safety pins in this instance to easily attach those two layers together so that the channel stitching, the stitching that you see on this sample, can be accomplished without having the layers shift. We're going to sew from the batik side, the stripe side, for obvious reasons, because we're going to use those stitching lines as the guideline, or excuse me, the printed lines as the guideline for stitching. Now, if you didn't want to stitch every single line in this instance, you could skip one, skip every other one, or if you would like to make and let's say an asymmetrical design, you could do that the same. Now, as you get to the neckline, stop with the needle in the fabric, and then pivot the fabric, move it so that you can continue to stitch onto the collar. And that's why we use that technique to match the front, back, and the collars together. And there you go. We have the channel stitching of one row accomplished. Use your dual feet on your machine or a walking foot if you have problems with it shifting. As I mentioned, take out the pins. It will take a little bit of time to do all of the stitching, but it's really a very enjoyable process. The next step, or practically the last step, is to attach the binding. In the first vest of this series, we worked with bias cut fabric, and you can do that too. You could add a bias cut fabric and bind the edges using the same fabric as we used for the inside. It does give a little limitation because perhaps this is too light to go with pants or whatever you might want to accessorize it with, but it does give a nice option. But the option we have chosen is to use the fabric of the fleece as the binding, and it's really quite a fast way, as we can just cut strips of the bias, crosswise strips. We don't have to, I should take the word bias out of this description because you're just going to cut crosswise strips, and it has a lot of stretch as it is a knit. This rolls to the wrong side so that you know which is the right side, and you meet the right side of the strip to the right side of the edge, which has been zigzagged, has been channel stitched. We're going to sew this with about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You may want to experiment with different widths that you want to work with. A presser foot width works well for me in this instance. We don't have a line to follow, a press mark to follow, but other than that we're going to follow the same techniques. Molding the fabric around the edges, making certain that they're about as even as you can get, and stitch. The beauty about using fleece as the binding, and we just have a little sample here, we're not taking obviously the full area, we're not binding the full area, is that the fleece will bind and move so nicely. And now we'll just wrap this to the underside. On this sample I've pinned the layers so that I can wrap it to the underside, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the well of the seam from the front of this area so that I attach all layers. And as I stitch in this area, on this sample, you can see the stitching is complete, and you may want to trim off any extra fabric from the back. After an impressive performance, fans often stand up and yell, "Encore!" Eileen Roche, editor of Designs and Machine Embroidery, joined me for the three-part series, Amazing Machine Embroidery Encore, as an update to an earlier series. Eileen shared her expertise on embroidery, a hot topic in sewing, combining modern high-tech sewing with traditional elements such as fabric and thread choices. In this clip, we demonstrated how to use a memory card to create a simple framed embroidery project. Our first project in this series is very simple, but it takes some planning, as all the projects of machine embroidery take. And you saw this earlier, where we have the Chinese proverb of a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Plus we have several other designs that go with this simple little quote and how true it is. Now Eileen, I'm going to first show everyone how to set up the machine, and then Eileen will give you the basics of working with embroidery. For computerized machine embroidery, there are two different types of mediums, three really, that you're going to find your designs on. We're going to first start with the simplest. That's a memory card. The cards are purchased to fit with specific machines. The cards go into the machine and the designs come right up on the screen, so it's a fast way. Another type of format is a floppy disk. Floppy disks and CDs need to work with your computer, plus software or a reader-writer program with your machine so that the computer can transfer the design into a memory card, so then you can put it in the machine. It takes a little extra step. Usually floppy disks are more reasonable, but you get the same wonderful results with either format or any of the three formats. You're going to use a machine embroidery thread. I have rayon thread chosen, all the colors that I need for this design, a lightweight bobbin thread, a machine embroidery needle. You put on your embroidery unit. Depending upon your type of machine, you'll have different instructions. You'll also be instructed to use a darning foot and lower the feed dogs so that the machine will determine where the design will be stitched. So that's the basic summary of the machine setup. But Eileen, when you chose this design or worked with it, you did a lot of planning.
I did, and it begins with the fabric. I chose a hand-painted fabric because it's a wonderful backdrop for embroidery. It lets the embroidery just pop right off of the scene. And then I worked with templates so that I could place my embroidery and know exactly what my end result would be before I started.
To get the scene effect, Eileen chose a darker fabric for the ground, drew a light line where she'd like her horizon, then did a straight stitch along that line.
That's right, Nancy. And then I use applique scissors and remove the excess fabric. At this point, I start my embroidery because I don't want satin stitching underneath of my embroidery. It may cause a bump.
Now we have added a little extra stability, a permanent stability, a fusible stabilizer heavyweight to this design since it's going to be framed. And we did that before doing any of the stitching, of course. And now you can use templates, as Eileen said. Purchase templates that we have here, and you kind of just tape them into place wherever you'd like the design. Don't look at the crosshairs right now, just look at where you'd like the footprints or the silhouette of the hiker to be. Now, if you don't have the purchased templates, you can make them yourself by stitching on a heavy or densely woven fabric, just the outline of the design. Mark the top. You can possibly see I have top marked on it, and I've cut it the size of my hoop so that I could place this wherever I'd like the footprints to go. Either way, it doesn't really matter which you use, just use a template.
That's right, because you'll get professional results before you even start.
Now I'm going to frame this within my hoop, placing the larger hoop on the tabletop and the smaller hoop on top of the fabric, which is over the lower hoop, and I'll press. And then, Eileen, you have the phrase already hooped on your sample, and
I do.
You can show that.
That's right. Nancy, what I did initially was I took the frame that the finished project sits in, and I laid that over top of my landscape and determined exactly where I want those words to be centered in that left frame. Once I determined that, I had my template taped down, and it was time to embroider. Once my fabric is hooped, I like to go and push the inner hoop down a little bit. That's called countersinking, and that adds a little bit more stability to your hoop project. Now I have my memory card with my designs on it, and I'm going to insert that into the machine, select card. I'm going to have a whole menu of designs that come up, and I need to search for my verse. Once I find it, I select it. At this point, the machine is going to ask me a number of items that Nancy had just walked us through, like did you lower your feed dogs and insert a full bobbin? And since I did do all those things, I can go ahead and raise my presser foot so that I can insert my hoop. Once I do that, I select OK. Now I see that my verse does not match my template. It is actually in a horizontal position, in a vertical position, and I need it to be in a horizontal position. So I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, and then I have to move my needle to the start position of my template. I'm able to do that on my machine by the up and down arrows. Once I'm exactly where I want it, I then lower my presser foot, remove my template. You don't want to stitch through it because you might want to use it again. And then it's time to stitch.
But before you stitch, why don't you put some stabilizer underneath?
Oh, absolutely, Nancy. And you had a really good point earlier where she takes cutaway or tearaway stabilizer and she slits a cut into it so that you can get underneath or right through that needle that has already penetrated the fabric. I guess, Nancy, you've taken 1 or 2 stitches before and realized you forgot that extra stabilizer.
It's so common.
Right. And now I'm ready to sew. As it sews, and this is a great design because it's only one color, so I only have inserted the one color, and I can either walk away from my machine or stay with it to make sure that nothing happens to the thread. And it's going to stitch it right out, and it's a beautiful process. Actually, we have one done. Nancy, if you want to take a look at that.
It's all in the planning because the stitching is so very simple. After the embroidery would be stitched, this is what the phrase will look like, the Chinese proverb, and you'll notice all these thread tails that jump between the various verses. What's needed now is just to clip those away after you've removed them from the hoop, and it will be a beautiful design. After one design has been embroidered, then remove the hoop from the fabric, reposition it so that you can stitch the other elements, and presto, you'll have a great gift. 20 years of sewing is a long time, but it can feel even longer if you haven't been taking advantage of the presser feet that are part of your machine's accessory box. In my three-part series, Fabulous Feet and Fancy Stitches, I demonstrate how to use those feet and introduce a few new options. One of my favorites is the multi-cord foot. If you've ever wrestled with decorative threads, trying to keep them aligned as you couch them in place, watch the next clip closely as I demonstrate the multi-cord foot. You just saw a close-up of the ingeniously designed multi-cord foot that has many openings for decorative threads so that you can stitch them down very easily with just a zigzag or a multiple zigzag stitch. Here's another look at that foot, and you can see that there are many openings. This one happens to have 9 openings, 3 different rows of openings, and to thread the foot with the decorative threads, you're going to place the serger looper threader using one of those crazy little threaders, inserting it from the underside of the foot, then inserting the ribbon through the opening, and here we go, and then pulling it through to the underside. Now here's a hint that I find invaluable, and that is just tack down the thread end so that as you're threading your next rows, you're not going to pull out what you just threaded. Trust me, I've done that, and they pull out very easily because the threads are lightweight and slippery. Now, speaking of the threads, heavyweight threads, decorative threads work best. Embroidery thread is too lightweight, so you have to do something that's, as you can see, I'm using a very lightweight ribbon. Whoops, you can see how slippery they are. Lightweight ribbon, thread it through this area, and pull it to the wrong side. You don't have to use all 9 cords. You could just use 3 or 2, the choice is yours, up to 9. After you have threaded all that you would like threaded, then tie a knot in the ends, holding these so they do not slip through the foot. I'm going to show you what we're going to be creating, and the block that you saw earlier is one of the many blocks on this baby blanket. We drew a heart-shaped with an air-soluble pen on the block of the fabric, and then a center line down to have one anchor stitch. So we determined a positioning row, and then adds a stabilizer. In the first program of this series, I discussed a lot about stabilizers. This is a press-on stabilizer. It's really important that you press this to the underside, and then you'll be stitching along one row of this, the marked row, and then all subsequent rows will be a presser foot width apart. On my machine, I have 4 threads I should say, inserted through my foot, so that I've already done the work, and I have a knot tied on the underside so that I do not have the opportunity of the threads pulling away. And to keep the threads on my lap from falling all over, I've placed them on a long knitting needle, or perhaps you'd like to put them on a coat hanger, just something so that they can be secured. My machine is set at a multiple zigzag stitch. It goes 3 stitches one way, 3 stitches the other way. And I have a 4 width, because that's the width of the opening of my presser foot. And the stitch length is about at 1. So I'm just going to raise the presser foot and kind of straighten out my threads, make certain that I have them pulled straight, and lower the presser foot. And the difficult part, or not the difficult part, but the interesting part is doing the threading. And now, as you can see, it's just zigzagging down into place. And I can try to comb these threads so that they stay somewhat straight, but they will feed through the guides of the multiple cord foot, so I don't have to worry about this. That multiple stitch works so well to secure everything down, but if you had a zigzag stitch, it would work fine too. And just so. I'm going to stop sewing at my mark. I use that air-soluble marking. Stop sewing at that area. And as I pull out my fabric from behind the foot, I'll just pull this out, cut the threads, but then, as you might guess, I'm going to tie these into a knot so that as I'm getting ready to do my next row stitching, I'm not going to pull out the threads. So the key is just to keep that knot area not stitched. And let me show you on our sample, where we've done several rows of stitches, how you handle the thread ends, or the decorative thread ends. You can't just clip them off because they'll ravel. Thread these through a large-eyed needle. Thread them to the underside. And here we have a water-soluble stabilizer on the underside, and then you can knot them, or what we did on our quilt sample is we did a straight stitch around the shape of the heart to secure the threads into place. So with a little time of threading decorative threads through the multi-cord foot, you can have a very impressive fancy stitch. Whenever someone asks me, what's the easiest fabric to sew, I quickly answer with one word: knits. That was true 20 years ago when the primary focus of Sewing with Nancy was garment construction, and it is true today as garment construction continues to play an important role. Knits are refreshingly simple to sew. The technique in this segment is what I like to call the easiest rugby shirt. The placket is sewn with one stitching step. You'll soon see why I call this series Easy Does It Knits. Rugby shirts are a mainstay in many wardrobes for casual wear, for sportswear. And to make one is extremely easy, especially if we take a little time to change the pattern piece, the facing pattern piece. If you look at a rugby shirt, you'll notice that there's a placket, an underlay placket, and the placket is also part of the under portion of the buttonhole side. I'll show you how easy it is to get this to line up without a lot of work and very, very simple sewing. I traced a size medium on my pattern for the shirt front, and I've placed a small piece of tissue paper over the top of the fabric, or the top of the pattern. This tissue paper is extending 1 inch beyond the center front of the shirt. That's the first important measurement, 1 inch beyond the center front. Then trace the neckline, the cutting line of the shirt, and your garment facing is going to have the same cutting line except it will be 1 inch longer. With a ruler, I'm going to measure to make certain that this facing is about 7 inches long. And then across the lower edge, make a line that's 4.5 inches wide. It doesn't have to be exact. This is just a rough measurement, but approximately 7 inches. Across the shoulder seam, measure 2.5 inches, or just the middle of the shoulder seam will be about the same thing. Then just simply connect the lower edge with the top edge. And now you've become a pattern designer, just like that. You may want to also transfer the grain line. This is your new facing piece. The extension that was placed at the 1 inch beyond the center front is going to be a fold. So you'd mark place on fold on that pattern piece, and you're ready to cut this out. The pattern piece that I have already cut out also has interfacing placed on it. But let me just show you. Placed it on the fold with that 1 inch extension. Before actually fusing the interfacing, I do a little nipping, or a clip at the center front fold, and as well as another clip at the lower edge. It will help me marking a little bit later. So I take off the pattern piece and open this up. You'll see some markings as well as interfacing in place. I used a knit fusible interfacing, a lightweight fabric. Requires a lightweight interfacing. It's a knit fabric, so we have a knit interfacing as well. You can see that I've already marked the pattern pieces with the markings, and now I'm going to simply just show you what I marked. And here I get my cutting tools. The first mark is to mark the fold, the center front, and I'm going to use a black pen. You would use your fabric marking pen. Then 3/4 of an inch to the left of the center front, place a line that's 6 inches long, 6 inches from the cut line, 3/4 of an inch, and then 6 inches long. Now keep in mind that we always have these instructions written in the booklet that accompanies the program. Center front, 3/4 of an inch to the left. We can set this aside now, and now I can mark the garment. We have small samples, but I'll show you we did much the same thing. I placed a nip at the center front as well as the lower edge. And now I'll mark the center front just to give you a bearing where we are. Those nips really save time in trying to find where the center front would be. Just little clips. You can see here that I have a strip of fusible interfacing. It's about 2 inches wide, and I fused it to the left of the center front. I need a little stability there. And then do the same marking, making it 6 inches long from the neckline, 3/4 of an inch to the left of the center front. Sounding like a broken record, but it's the same markings. We're going to stack the facing to the garment along these 3/4 of an inch markings. You always meet right sides together. So the first time you have to kind of peek underneath to make sure that you are lining the right pattern pieces together. And then let me check underneath here. You may want to place a pin through the bottom area and see how close you come out on the garment. And I'll just move this over just a touch. This is going to be the stitching line. I mentioned it's a one-step stitching. We're going to stitch with a guide, and the guide will be basting tape. Usually use this 1/8 of an inch wide basting tape to put seams together, to hold seam edges. It's double-sided. Well, we really only need one side, and we need it as a seam guide. Here you can see that I'm sewing along the tape edge. As I'm reaching that bottom point, I'm simply going to shorten my stitch length, sew to a point, and then sew up the other side. So it's a really one step of sewing. After doing the sewing, and here you can see a sample that has been stitched, you can cut right down the center. I've removed the tape, as you can see. Here it's been cut, and if you found that you went one stitch too far or you clipped a little bit too far, just re-stitch this lower edge to reinforce it. When I flip the stitching, or flip the facing to the inside, you can see how this is forming the placket. When I match the shoulder seams of the left side, the two fabrics align right at the fold. When I match the shoulder seams of the right side, we have the placket, the extension, already formed. Now the next step is to work with a collar. You can use a collar pattern piece and use the single knit or interlock you're working with, or I'm using a knit collar. You wouldn't use such a contrasting collar as I have here, but then match the collar at the center front markings. One edge is finished, one edge is raw, so you can tell which edges to go together, and you pin the collars to the respective center fronts. And I'm just going to use this on the sample. You would have the back shoulder seam stitched at this point, but just to show you where they're matched up, I'd like you to see this. Then simply wrap the facing around the collar, sandwiching the collar between the garment and the facing. Match the shoulder seam of the facing to the shoulder seam of the garment. And let me show you that in another sample that really has a back attached. I have lots of samples, as you might gather. This has been stitched, and it has also been matched properly. The shoulder seam of the facing is aligning to the shoulder seam of the garment. You may find that you have to stretch this front just a little bit because the interfacing has made it a little bit more stable. This pattern called for a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and so that's what we used when sewing around the neckline. And you might want to, before doing any trimming, just turn this right side out to see how it looks. And I'll do that for you now. I'll just turn, first of all, the left side out, bring out the point. Notice where the collar is matched. Now turn the opposite side and bring it to a point. There are a few finishing details left. We need to tack the facing, attach it to the shoulder seam, but here is the underside where the placket is formed, and here's the top side. All it is left are the buttons and buttonholes. In the 20 years I've been on TV, I've had the privilege of sharing my classroom with some of the sewing industry's best teachers. Mary Malari is one of those teachers. She has joined me for a remarkable number of these TV programs, and you, my viewers, never tire of her charming personality or clever techniques. Recently, I taped a program with Mary based on her book, Made for Travel. This next clip is your ticket to a carefree sewing journey, as Mary demonstrates how to make circle bags.
Circle bags are the next made-for-travel easy sew accessories that are perfect for day trips or extended vacations. Circle shapes on the ends of the bag create the unique shape. Choose from a wide variety of fabrics for these bags, including medium to heavyweight fabrics such as denim, tapestry, fleece, corduroy, quilted fabrics, and even velveteen.
Mary and I would now like to show you the easy construction of these bags. You need to cut two shapes, a circle and rectangle.
Nancy, for this project today, we've chosen the medium-sized circle, and this is approximately 5.5 inches in diameter, and we'll cut 2 of those. And then we cut a rectangle that's 12 inches by 17 inches in size.
12 by 17, and a zipper that's longer than 12 inches.
That will be the edge that we sew the zipper to, so we'll bring the 2 raw edges together, and we'll match the zipper to these edges and pin it in place, and then sew it. I often use 2 seams to make a good sturdy zipper attachment.
Now the zipper is stacked on top of the fabric and stitched. The zipper, we're not making a concealed zipper or a lap zipper. It's just a very simple zipper, but use the zipper as part of the decoration of the bag.
A nice feature to add are some tabs on the end. This is a piece of synthetic suede that I've stitched across the end of the zipper, and then we'll add the other one to this other end. This will help you to open and close the zipper on the bag.
If you didn't have synthetic suede, use a ribbon loop.
That's right, or other fabric.
After sewing across the zipper, then you can cut off the extra zipper length.
And then we're ready simply to match the circle ends to the opening on the sides of the bags.
We'll simply fold the bag in half and mark the point at the end and fold it in half again to quarter mark it.
I have the circle quarter portioned also, and it's a very easy thing then to fit the 2 together, matching the marks.
So we would just stack the marks all around the edges. And I have found, Mary, that when sewing a circle, if you would place the feed dogs or the square or rectangle next to the feed dogs, it will ease in a little bit more readily.
That's right.
1/4 of an inch seam allowance is all that is needed next to do the sewing. And if you'd like to clean finish the edges, zigzag or serge, that would be fine too. But in minutes, wow.
Turn it right side out and we have a completed bag that can hold all kinds of things in your travels.
And notice how these little tabs work so easily.
I like to add that to the end of the zipper for ease in opening and closing also.
Now the smaller bag, which you saw earlier, was this one right here. Great pencil bag, cosmetic bag, but look at this one. Just change the fabric.
This is quilted velvet, Nancy, and I chose a very elegant zipper. And the cord is satin cord, and so you have a great handbag. You might store your essentials in it in the suitcase, but then for travel and for the evening,
lovely.
You're set.
Now you could just extend the length of the bag, and this you use as a neck roll.
This for traveling and sleeping in an airplane. I've stuffed it with 2 plastic dry cleaner bags that I store just with a rubber band, and then I carry the bag empty, but when I want to use it as a neck roll, I stuff it with the plastic.
Whether you're making a neck roll, a cosmetic bag, or an evening bag, the circle bag pattern is your ticket for made-for-travel accessories. 20 years ago, the initial focus of Sewing with Nancy was garment construction. After 20 years, we've shown all types of sewing. If you can sew it, I've taught it. One of the people who has helped me behind the scenes of Sewing with Nancy is Donna Fensky, designing many unique projects. In this clip, Donna joins me in front of the scenes for a 3-part series entitled Chalk It Up to demonstrate using non-traditional chalkboard fabric to make a clever wall calendar. We would like to start by pointing out the various elements of this calendar. First of all, the chalkboard, which is the most novel part of it, the main component. This fabric is made out of polyvinyl chloride, PVC, and on the back of this fabric you'll see a scrim that's cotton and polyester. You can't wash it, but you can wipe the surface clean. The unique part of this calendar is that a calendar sheet can be put in a window.
It's a window pocket. It's basically 9 inches by 12, and we cut out so that we have a window frame.
Out of clear vinyl. Then the various fabrics to go around the edges. This is a directional print. You can see the houses. And Donnie, you have a sample of another directional print.
We have another directional print here, and the yardages will change with the directional print versus possibly a border print. The next fabric here we have is a border print, and we would basically just use it across the 12-inch section of our chalkboard calendar.
Now the fabric needs to be cured before you can work with it.
So what you do to cure the fabric is you take the chalk and you actually color the whole piece of chalk, or the whole piece of chalkboard fabric. After it's been colored with the chalk, you have to wipe it clean. And again, let the surface dry, and we're going to do it again. Then we have to color it one more time, And again, we will wipe it clean, and that cures the chalkboard fabric. Then we're ready to construct our chalkboard calendar.
It's like an old-fashioned slate and simply can be sewn through. The vinyl pockets are first.
Right, we're going to start with the 9x12 window pocket. Basically, it's a solid piece of vinyl, and I like to tape it to my cutting mat. And what I'm going to do is simply cut 1 inch in along the edges. I will come close to the corners, and I will finish cutting the corners with my scissors. So I will cut all the way around with my rotary cutter and finish cutting into the corners with my scissors. Then after the window pocket has been cut, we're simply going to tape it to the bottom edge of our calendar.
And this piece is 9 inches wide by a total of
23.5. And then we have a second vinyl pocket that will be positioned slightly above the window pocket. And we save the paper because we're going to use that at the sewing machine, and we're going to place the paper over the top of our vinyl. And here you can see that we're stitching on the paper edge, stitching down the lower edge of our vinyl pocket.
And by magic here we have it already stitched. The machine stitching perforates the paper and you can remove it. And notice our pins. We can't use pins per se.
Right. Next, what we're going to be doing is adding borders. Again, our borders are 3.5 inches wide by 23.5 inches in length. And here we use like little hair clips to secure it prior to sewing because we cannot use pins again.
The top borders have 4 patches at each end, and to make the 4 patch, if you haven't made that before, simply cut 2-inch strips of 2 fabrics. We have a black and a red checkerboard stitched together. I'm going to unpin my samples, and after you have stitched them together, press and then alternate 2 strips so that you have black on one side and opposite on the other, and cut into 2-inch subcuts.
Right, and basically we're going to be making a total of 4 patches. And we're going to then attach them to our cute little border print, and then these will be stitched at the top and lower edge of our calendar. And then after that, the next thing will be is to layer the batting and the backing.
We have lots of future calendars here, Donna. Here we have all the borders attached. Simple sewing techniques, very marginal fabric requirements, and then the backing and batting are next.
The backing is about 5/8 inches, 5/8 of a yard, and also the batting. And what we do is we lightly tape the backing to our surface and smooth everything nice and flat. We will pin through just the fabric areas. And then we will, at the sewing machine, we'll basically stitch in the ditch around all of our chalkboard fabric. We will also come into the 4 patch.
And now we'd like to show you the finishing details of this calendar. Now for the finishing details. Donna mentioned a few minutes ago about stitching in the ditch, attaching all the layers together. On this sample you can see from the wrong side of the calendar where she has stitched in the well of the seam around the chalkboard fabric. The blue fabric is the rod pocket, cut about 6 or 3 inches wide, a little bit shorter than the length of the top, and basted to the top area after folding it in half and finishing the short ends so that later a rod could be inserted through this area. The next step is to create the fabric for the binding. We have cut binding strips 2.5 inches wide, and on the starting end of the binding, angle cut it at a 45-degree angle and turn under some fabric about 1/4 of an inch. Along that 1/4 of an inch press some paperback fusible web. This will make attaching the top or the starting and ending spots much easier. And Donna will show you how easy it is to attach the binding.
Okay, also on our wall hanging, after you have it all stitched in the ditch, you want to square it up so you have a nice clean finish. And I have positioned the French binding in the middle of my border, and I'm going to start sewing about 4 inches to 5 inches from the folded under edge. And I also have my open toe foot on because I like to use it because I can set a 1/4 inch seam with my open toe foot, and get a perfect seam. And at the corners, what I like to do is I like to place a pin in diagonally at the corner, because we're going to stop sewing right at the pin mark. So we're going to sew again 1/4 of an inch seam all the way down to the corner, stopping right at the pin. Then we're going to pull it out from our machine. And to create the miter corner, we have to do some folding techniques. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the binding and fold in a diagonal fold up to the top edge of our wall hanging. Then we have to bring the binding back down on itself. We're going to create a very square edge up here, and we're lining up to 2 folds here. And I want to just get this a little better. And now we're going to sew right on the edge, excuse me, and we're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam.
Starting right at the fold.
Right at the fold. We're going to repeat this 4 times all the way around our wall hanging.
This sample shows a smaller sample showing how all 4 corners have been stitched. There's an opening yet through the center, but I want to point out what Donna just stitched, this special corner. When you turn this to the underside, it folds or forms a miter. Perfect. By sewing 1/4 of an inch seam, stopping 1/4 of an inch from the corner, this is what occurs. Now, to finish the binding in the center, remove the paper of the paperback fusible web, nest the other binding inside the first binding, and press this closed. You may want to trim off some of the excess seam allowances. Then stitch the remaining of the seam. The last step will be at the top to turn under all the corners and pin. Another stitching in the ditch, stitching in the well of the seam will finish the top edge and all around the edges of the quilt. And those are the simple finishing details. Over the last 5 years, promoting volunteerism has been a mainstay of Sewing with Nancy. We started with Sew a Smile series, which received the greatest number of responses of any of my shows. We've changed the name to Creative Kindness to include sewing, quilting, and other handiwork. Gail Brown, another popular guest, joined me for a series entitled Creative Kindness to share inspiring stories and projects. In the following clip, Gail and I demonstrate how to make items for a baby layette.
After being featured on Sewing with Nancy, Pins and Needles, a sewing machine dealership in Cleveland, Ohio, received donations and inquiries from across the country. Their Sewing for Babies Club, shown here at one of their weekly meetings, remains dedicated to sewing for needy infants. One volunteer sums up the sentiment shared by so many. I suppose I started because I wanted to help, but after sewing and donating layette items, I find I have gained so much more than I have given.
Next, Gail and I would like to share with you some layette items. With a small investment of time and fabric, you can make a big difference in the lives of a needy family and their new child. This fast-to-finish 4-piece layette includes a sleeper, t-shirt, pants, and receiving blankets that can be either sewn or serged. Our multi-size pattern includes the often hard-to-find preemie size shown on our babies. Sewing for little babies is fun and really doesn't take a lot of time. And as I mentioned, we have preemie sizes. And the preemie sizes are the size of our cute little babies here. And the ribbing is so small and the patterns are tiny that we're going to show you how to complete the garments with flat construction ideas. But the pattern that we include in the reference book that accompanies this program, you need to have it enlarged, 150% for preemie sizes, and then use a small size, or for the regular small, medium, and large, enlarge the pattern 200%.
And Nancy, I go to a Quick Copy Center to have that done. It's very fast, easy, and inexpensive.
Great idea. Now, as I mentioned, sewing in a circle, putting the ribbing on the lower edge of the cuff or the pants is almost impossible with these little sizes. So we just cut the ribbing. This happens to be the preemie size. So you can see it doesn't have to be quartered. It can just be pinned on each end of the lower edge of the sleeve and stretched.
And you can just stretch it to fit the edge, and doing it in the flat just makes so much sense. And you're just using a straight stitch for that?
Straight stitch for the first go around, and then we'll follow it by a zigzag stitch. If you had a serger, you can definitely serge it.
And all the seams on this pattern are 1/4 of an inch.
That's right. So quickly, one row with a straight stitch, And then after doing that straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam, we'll just push a zigzag stitch on your machine or set your machine to a zigzag stitch and put all the edges together. I'm using black thread. You would use, of course, in this instance, a mint color thread, but the contrast shows off. Then after attaching the ribbing to the top, to the lower edge of the sleeves, to the lower edge of the pants, then you can sew the sleeves to the front, to the back, and put the ribbing around the neckline. Now, Gail, when working with a preemie, you like to scale down the ribbing.
I like to cut the ribbing 2 inches wide rather than 3 inches wide for the preemie size.
Sure.
It comes out less of a turtleneck.
Then we can simply sew or serge the final edge, which includes making the neckline in a circumference or in a circle. Sew the underarm seams, put in a hem, and the top is finished. We can also work with the sleeper item and just lengthen the t-shirt pattern.
I lengthen it 10 or 12 inches for depending on the length that you do need, and it's the same construction.
And in the booklet that accompanies this series, we give you the simple zipper construction idea. Babies need blankets.
They sure do. And I'd like to show you a blanket that I've made using flannel on one side and a lightweight fleece on the other, and I finished it with serged yarn. And for this setup, and I've got my blanket in my machine right now, but so that I can serge continuously, I pre-rounded all my corners and I notched out an edge so that I can tuck my serger foot right in there and serge around for a neater start and finish. And as I serge, I'm serging with a loosened serger yarn so that it wraps the edge, and then a tighter tension on woolly nylon thread in the needle, and a width, narrow to medium width. And it's very easy to perfect your stitch only using the 2-thread setup.
Now, if you did not have or don't have a serger, you can definitely create baby blankets with a straight stitch or a decorative stitch on your sewing machine, but be sure and vary the sizes.
You can range anywhere from 22 to 45 inches wide, depending on the size of the baby and the needs.
And in this instance, we have cut the backing larger than the top layer, and then after doing some stitching in the ditch, or I should say not really stitching in the ditch, but quilting the layers together about every 5 inches, then you can make folded corners by trimming the backing 1 inch larger than the top fabric, folding once, folding twice at each corner, and then to create the folded miter, fold once and fold twice, and I'll quickly pin this. And then the other corner, fold once, fold twice, and you can get that miter just folded perfectly and then straight stitch or decoratively stitch into place. Now I'd like to tell you about another Creative Kindness star.
Needy babies bring out the best in volunteers, and Eunice Sprung, shown here with a special little friend, is no exception. Her Corona, South Dakota-based volunteer group, So Special, has made nearly 33,000 layette items in just 7 years. Despite her diminished eyesight, the high demand for her labor of love projects, and exhaustive fundraising schedule, Eunice perseveres, steadfast to her calling, serving children and their families.
One of our goals in presenting this series to you is to connect you with other sewers and other groups, to connect and to keep you up to date on charities. And the answer to that was our Creative Kindness website.
Yes, and we've compiled a comprehensive resource list on our creativekindness.com website. And here you'll find this up-to-date information on groups, projects, and needs. If you're not connected to the internet, then send us a stamped, self-addressed envelope,
Business-sized envelope.
business-sized
There you go.
envelope, to Nancy's Notions, P.O. Box 683, Beaver Dam, Wisconsin 53916.
And we'll send that listing to you in the mail. Thanks for joining me in my classroom to celebrate 20 years of sewing on television. I hope that you've enjoyed learning some of my favorite techniques. Keep in mind, there's much more to learn from the other portions of the videotapes and books. And as I've closed every show for the past 20 years by saying, thanks for joining me. Bye for now.
Visit Nancy's website at www.sewingwithnancy.com for more information on this program. Sewing with Nancy has been made possible by grants from the following companies: PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines; Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears; Madeira Threads, because creativity is never black and white; Prim Drifts, the source for sewing and quilting notions; Amazing Designs by Great Notions, your one source for home embroidery and design software; Koala Cabinets, designed with maximum storage using minimum space; Rowenta, professional performance and beautiful results for all types of ironing; and Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.